Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm James Milan. This is the DPCD update. And I am speaking, of course, the director of our Department of Planning and Community Development, Jennifer Raitt. Jenny, thanks for joining me as usual.
Great to
Uh,
be here
I should say as
again.
usual for thanks, not that you join me as
Yes.
usual. But anyway, we find ourselves here in the first week of February. And as we know, while, you know, frankly, Black history deserves to be celebrated in every month of the year, as I think we all realize. This is a time that we all pause and do that kind of thing. And I'd love to bring that into the realm of department that handles planning for a town, such as you do. I'm mindful of the fact that going back to last summer, where we had a series of community conversations, one of those was devoted to how racism has played out over time in the area of housing and zoning. And the whole concept of redlining and what that has meant for access for communities of color to housing, et cetera. I'd like to just kind of pick up, if you don't mind, from that conversation. I know it was a while back, but I'd love for you to kind of talk a little bit, give us a little bit of context from history for folks who wouldn't have seen that conversation, and then kind of zoom ahead to where we are today here in Arlington and what the big challenges are in this area when it comes to planning and zoning.
Sure, I'd be glad to. I guess maybe to put things into some context, we're talking about our built environment and our landscape and how we interact with the land that we live on today. And how that came to be is through a series of policies and practices and rules and laws. And a lot of that still is in place today. It looks a little bit different, of course, and we've, amended and updated things, and we don't conduct ourselves as we did at the, early part of the in like the 1900s. But those laws and regulations are still the underpinning of how we use land today. And so that's a little bit of just sort of my introduction to this concept, is that planning really came to be around issues of organizing the land in a better way, and organizing communities as well. And the sort of fundamentally, when we talk about zoning, which is really basically what tells us the rules and the laws that tell us what can and cannot be built and where it can and cannot be built, and how, of course, that really started in the 1900s. Really, at sort of the early part of that century, there was something called racial zoning, and it meant that communities were using their zoning bylaw, which was just coming to be, including the one of the first ones in Baltimore in 1910, included racial zoning, which means that in its zoning bylaw, they had language that was discriminatory and meant to to segregate races of people, by saying that only certain people could live in this district or that district or in this type of housing, et cetera. So it was very explicit, until a time when there was a Supreme Court case that ruled that it was, of course, not allowable to have racial zoning. What then happened, though, after that time was, even though the Supreme Court ruled that it was, unconstitutional to have racial zoning, there were still things that were in place for many decades after that time, including racial covenants and other types of restrictions on land and homes that people could buy, and also financial instruments that made it impossible for integration, and instead made it much more likely that we would continue to see segregation, and perpetuate segregation, in fact. And at the same time, while that was happening, continuation of a lot of different federal policies were put into place that also continued to perpetuate segregation. Everything from the New Deal in the 1930s up through the 1950s of the Interstate Highway Building Act, urban renewal, All of these things really had at their root, in some way or another, an element of racial discrimination and the intention of perpetuating a segregated world that we live in. And at the same time that all of those things are happening, we came to see what is considered to be exclusionary zoning practices. Because it's unconstitutional to have, make racist policies codified in zoning bylaws, there are, of course, other mechanisms that communities can use and have used that we now call and consider to be exclusionary practices. And those are basically zoning bylaws that exclude certain populations and groups from single family neighborhoods, or exclude multifamily rental housing from neighborhoods and neighborhoods that are ones that have better access to jobs and transit and schools and amenities, et cetera. So those are sort of, remnants of what we still see today. Of course, there's still discrimination, there's still racism, there are still inequities and disparities. But in terms of just talking about land use and zoning, what we see today in terms of our built landscape and built environment is the residue of exclusionary policies and practices. And I won't say that they're gone.
Right.
I will not say that they're not still in effect. I will say that we often find ourselves trying to work around them. And that's because many planners today and the people who work with the planning community try very hard to think through their policies and practices, because we have an ethical responsibility as planners to the community to make sure that we are thinking about and putting diversity, equity, and inclusion at the forefront of what we're doing. So,
So it's a long history you've just outlined for us pretty quickly. Really a long history of all kinds of efforts from overt to covert just to keep communities apart, communities of different races, ethnicities, et cetera, apart. So here we are finding ourselves, as you said, at the not near the end necessarily of that process, still with the residue of all that history. So what are we doing now to address those things here in Arlington?
well, I think we're still working on it, and I think that some of those things, and we'll continue to work on it. But I think some of those things include, we have a master plan, and we've talked about that a bit before. But the outcome of having a master plan is to then amend our zoning bylaw in accordance with that plan. But to, I think, use the equity lens as a way that we're looking at implementing that master plan is perhaps a little bit different than we might have thought of it in 2015 when we first adopted the plan. But it means looking at what types of zoning amendments we're doing or considering, and what impact those zoning amendments might have on the community, which means really understanding, if there's a disparate impact on any parts of our community, and not just in Arlington, but more broadly. Are we still being welcoming to having new people move to Arlington? Do we have the doors open? So really measuring the impact of different zoning amendments, that's one piece. And I think that our Fair Housing Action Plan is another really good example of something that will actually provide us with some good guidance in terms of other types of either town bylaw or even zoning bylaw amendments that will help us to have sort of built in, and I use the word codify, but usually, but built into the process, really understanding whether or not something has that kind of impact. So it's not just a practice or a policy, but it's actually a codified way that we are doing business. So those are just a couple of examples, but there's a lot of other things within the planning department that we're also considering, including how we're looking at our economic development work, how we're looking at our environmental and climate resiliency work, for example. Those two programs currently, both of the people who are leading those two programs, or many programs under them, are looking at their work through an equity lens and really trying to find ways to be inclusive in their engagement, and to think about equity in all of their policies.
Yeah, it does sound to me then like a lot of what you're saying that can most effectively be implemented here in town has to do with how you do things, as opposed to, changing the letter of the law or scrapping the entire system and coming up with something new or something like that. Instead, it is this kind of ongoing scrutinizing of what the potential effects are of decisions in a way that is really through this prism more deliberately and hopefully more effectively than has been done in the past. And I suspect that you feel confident. I hope you feel confident that we can affect change here in town in that way.
I'm very confident about it. I mean, I think that a lot more people are talking about this. They're talking about ways to become more inclusive and make sure that we have, inclusive policies and practices within the town in general, just, not just talking about planning and community development, but well beyond that. So I think there's certainly a demand for it, and demand then informs accountability often. So I think that's also good. Um, and so,
Yeah,
yes, I'm very confident, certainly in the department's ability to pursue this and to think about impact. There's a lot of focus sometimes on intention, but I think impact is really what we need to be focused on.
well, I regret to say that our time is lamentably short today for what is for a conversation that clearly merits longer consideration. And I will hope that we can continue to pick up the threads of this conversation in future updates as the opportunity arises for us. But for today, we are out of time. Thank you very much, Jenny, for spending this time with us and giving us a real dose, mini in time, but plenty substantive in content of where we are coming from and hopefully where we are heading to when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion as it relates to zoning policies and to planning here in town. So for this DPCD update with Jennifer Raitt, our director of our Department of Planning and Community Development, I'm James Milan. Sure appreciate your being with us, Jenny, and thank you out
Welcome.
there for watching as well. We will see you next time.